Forti is a senior lecturer at the SGTP in the Institute of Psychiatry and a consultant psychiatrist at the Maudsley, South London Maudsley NHS Trust. She's done quite lots of landmark work on the issue of cannabis and psychosis, and it's in the world of psychiatric epidemiology. It's one of the most tricky causal questions at the moment, or has been for a while actually, about the chicken and the egg situation, whether cannabis causes psychosis or people with psychosis more likely to take cannabis. And she's done a lot of groundbreaking work in this area, and particularly around the role of skunk and sort of higher potency forms of cannabis and their risks associations with psychosis. And I also note that she's currently runs the first and only cannabis clinic for patients with psychosis in the UK, so maybe we'll hear a little bit about that, but that started earlier this year.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's actually quite funny because when Tanya invited me and he said, would you like to come to the Southwest meeting? I live in Wimbledon in London, and that's Southwest. Therefore, it might be around the corner from where I live. So this tells you what Richard was pointed out, how parochial we can become. For me, the world begins and ends with London. So I'm very pleased to have taken a train and come all the way to Bristol. And I have to say, I loved Claire's presentation. I'm an EI consultant. And I've been an EI consultant since I got my exams for free. I don't get paid by the NHS, but I wouldn't work as a clinician anywhere else because I think ER, as you said, the care we should always deserve, even if we had hypertension. I think the model is a great model. Anyway, this is now advertising for EI. So as you can see, the title is slightly different from the one you have. We kept it general so that I could then decide to fit in what I thought might be of interest. So I'm going to talk, of course, about cannabis and psychosis, and I'm going to use some of the examples from the latest work we have done. And Raj was very good. I didn't do any of this work. We did it. I mean, it's really always a huge collaborative effort. If you want to do research, you cannot be paranoid because you can only succeed if you're happy to compromise and work with lots of other people, even the one you might don't like very much. So I'm going to start with this picture. There is lots of talk about when we consider substance misuse or getaway theory. Usually we say if you start with tobacco, then that's a getaway for everything else. Cannabis, it's a getaway, not only to other substances, but usually to a successful political career. So it's been the case for many prime minister and presidents, especially of the United States, not the current one actually. Now, in terms of the evidence, we have now 3 meta-analyses who have all consistently pointed as a positive association between pre-existing cannabis uses and the risk of developing later a psychotic disorder. And in particular, I'm going to show you the graph from the only one that didn't only look at the question, have you ever used cannabis, yes or no, and then looked at the association with later psychosis, but tried to put together all those studies who had collected at least one measure of amount, could have been frequency, could have been quantity or duration, and in a very nice statistical way was able to transform this sort of quite basic measure into a continuous degree of exposure. And what this graph is really telling you, each line is one of the study, that with the increase of amount of cannabis, which is the y-axis, you get a greater odds ratio for psychotic disorder. So this was a way to use a meta-analysis approach to once again reinforce the idea of a dose relationship between cannabis use and psychosis, which I think if you are a psychiatrist or even a medic, is like discovering not the chicken or the egg, but just the egg. I mean, we do know that more you take of a substance, more you get of its side effect. We know this is the case even for the medication we prescribe. But it was nice to be able to show this, at least with the evidence that has been collected to date. But now I want to bring you in the context of where my research question that have really led the research I've done so far have come from. And they've not come from great research inspiration, but actually from my clinic. So I work in Leo, and we are a little bit of inner city London, and our case log is currently 350 first capital psychosis patients, and 2/3 of them have used cannabis and still using cannabis when they are referred to our clinic. So cannabis is in your face, not because just of the smell when you walk out of the office, but also because it's something so significantly and consistently reported that I think it would be negligent to sort of ignore its potential role. And one of the things they ask me is, well, okay, you say, they don't call me Dr. Deforti, I don't think they can pronounce it. They say, Marta, you say cannabis has played a role in my psychosis, but my mates are still out there and they've not come to this clinic. And so my point was, well, do we actually know who are the cannabis users, even the heavy cannabis users, who are really at risk of developing a psychotic disorder? And of course, one question is it about the quantity, the joints, what you put in it? So we started looking into the question of not only quantity, but also the type of cannabis. And the second one, which is a question I used to get not from my patients, but mostly from paper reviewers or the skeptics on cannabis and psychosis, is, well, if it is a risk factor, how comes we haven't seen an increase in the rates of psychosis, given that, they've been across the world and an increase in the prevalence of cannabis use? So I'll try to go through these questions with you. But first of all, it's always polite to introduce your key, your prima donna in the talk. And in my case, it's cannabis. So this is, of course, about London. Have you ever had a published, because I'm not aware of it, a potency study from the Southwest? Has the Home Office ever cared what kind of cannabis you have in your street so far? No. Well, they don't care about London either. And the last one, we had to pay for it. But in 2008, the Home Office did actually publish the only potency study that did include the London area and mostly area like Kent and a couple of other constabulary around outside London. And they were, at the time, they were able to identify 3 main types of cannabis. This one is imported herbal, or what people will know as weed and grass or old-fashioned herbal cannabis. And this is skunk. You don't need to be a botanicist to tell the difference between these two. And the main difference is this high density of the fluorescence. And these are the one where you find inside the active ingredients of cannabis, especially the THC. And this is why, and this is quite funny to me, because being Italian first language, it took me a while to realize this was the link. So of course this is called skunk because it really smells very intensely. And so if you are a cannabis user, people say, how do you know when you ask your patients or participants in the research that they know they're using skunk and not something else? It's a bit insulting to think that. When we ask somebody who drinks alcohol, would you tell the difference between a sip of white wine and whiskey? I mean, you don't need to be an alcohol connoisseur to be able to tell the strength of what you're putting in your mouth. And young people who use cannabis do know the difference between the two. They look different, they smell different, they feel different when you touch them, and indeed the effect is, even in terms of the pleasurable effect, very different. And then there is the almost disappearing one, which is hashish or resin cannabis, at least in London. And these 3 types look different, but also a fundamental difference is the content of 2 of the over 100 cannabinoids. And this is important to me because we are beginning to really understand about cannabis. We talk a lot about THC and CBD like they were the only 2 components. These are the only 2 we have studied so far extensively. And we know that in this type of cannabis, the amount of THC in 2005, but consistently even in 2018, vary a lot, with the highest proportion of THC being found in type of cannabis like skunk, which goes up to 16%. And in skunk, there is pretty much no CBD. There are very neglectable traces, like 0.001%. And then you have the imported herbal, which is a bit in between, where you do have, again, only THC like skunk, but the THC is much, much less. And then at least the resin or hashish in the early home potency study had a concentration of THC which was equal to the one of imported herbal, but also had CBD with a ratio 1:1, and that was actually very interesting, and we'll see together why. There's something to say. Ash is changing. The last data from the European Monitoring Centre for Drug and Alcohol has actually shown that the hashish that we mostly get still from Morocco, or the one we get from Pakistan, is not indeed this concentration of THC, but it has up to 18% of THC. Basically what they're doing, they are making soft bar or resin cannabis with skunk oil or with the plant where you get skunk. So I always say it's not about going around and saying hashish is very good, just go little. We don't really know until these things are done consistently. We don't really know. This is refers to the time when these data were collected. So why does cannabis type matter? So in South London, where I work as a clinician, we collected, as part of a collaborative study, a large sample of young people presenting with the first episode of psychosis and controls that we wanted to represent the local population, not the classic friends and family of the Institute of Psychiatry researcher. And what we did, using a more detailed information on cannabis use, we began to ask them about frequency and other details, and I was mostly interested in two variables, frequency and type, that people reported, because the Home Office study had just come out, the first one, so we could relate a little bit when people said skunk or herbal or hashish, roughly on the potency to expect. And we put together this little combined measure of frequency and type. Even if you can't read, what I like you to see is just how from your left to your right is going up in a sort of quite nice linear fashion. So the first bar on your left is the reference group, which is people that report never using cannabis. And then the other groups are different combination of frequency and type. The first two little bars are actually a combination of people that use hashish, and the first one says less than once a week, the second one says at weekends, and then every day. And what is interesting, the first three bars after the reference, as you can see, don't go above 1. In fact, they're below 1. So in this study, we indicated that the people that were using hashish didn't matter from the frequency. They weren't experiencing an increase in the odds ratio to psychosis. As soon as you got into the skunk domain, you began to have a significant increase in the odds ratio. With the everyday skunk users, they had an odds ratio above 5. And we control for other substances of abuse, including stimulants that for us in psychosis are very relevant, and important social demographic confounders. So people got very excited about this and said, oh, can I use hashish and then reduce actually my odds for psychosis? I'm afraid it doesn't work that way. The people in the hashish group, there was not a significant protective effect. Really, the bottom line was they didn't experience an increase in the odds ratio for psychosis compared to the never users. So hashish in this group didn't seem to have an effect. It did have an effect on the Queen lifestyle. Since this study, I don't know about young people, who are the one I really wanted to reach, but she has been now smelling all the sample of cannabis she receives to exclude. This is actually not a spoof. The Queen did at some point in her lifetime received a sample of cannabis. She knew she had to smell it, and I hope she didn't try, although she's probably beyond the age of risk for psychosis. But what about being able to link this a little bit with the question of what is the impact at the population level? So I work in a clinical service. For me, it is important if you can estimate the number of new cases of psychosis you might get because of a risk factor in a specific area. So this is by all means my area, so this might not translate to the southwest. But when you look at southeast London, if you are able to abolish skunk use, you will be able to reduce the number of new cases of psychosis of 24%. I think for any clinician, you will know 24% less cases of psychosis is huge, and it's not really only about services. When you think about family, for them, even one case less is crucially important, and more so for the individual. And this was important to me because we thought, well, if this is true, if this replicates, in some way, and you think about primary prevention, it's just about asking one question. Do you use skunk? You don't have to have 10 hours questionnaires or 10 hours psychopathology assessment. It's just about asking people, what's your lifestyle? Do you use any substances? And if they say yes, or also cannabis, never ask, do you use any illicit drugs? Young people do not know about illicit drugs. They say to me, no, I don't use any, I just use cannabis. So it's just about asking them, what do you do in your free time? Do you use any substance without necessarily giving a label? And so these were the first data we had on this link of the potential impact at the population level for high potency. But as I said, I get very parochial with this Southeast London and or Southwest where I live, so we decided to go beyond the English channel for once. And before doing that, we wanted to see what was actually happening also nationwide in UK. So this is an indoor cannabis plantation. And this is real picture. It's not But this is a vignette of the next door neighbor who was saying, what's going on next door? They always have the light on. And this is because it's not very difficult to set an indoor plantation. You need to get these online, cost only £5.20, or at least it did recently. And then you set up lots of light, and then you hook your electricity to your next door neighbor, so they get the bill like these poor people. And I got this from a very nice police conference where they were reporting of being big national seizures of cannabis, where they were going in the Manchester metropolitan area, over the Manchester metropolitan area with helicopter in winter, and they were looking at, this was one of the years where we had snow, and they were looking, snow on the roof, snow, no snow, snow on the roof, no snow. And believe it or not, most of the time these were actually indoor cannabis plantations. So you can look at your neighbors as well if he does snow this year. And the sad thing is that we always talk about what is UK manufacturing. Well, we are actually independent for manufacturing skunk. We are now, this is actually serious, we are self-sufficient on skunk. We don't need to import cannabis any longer, so this might rescue our economy if we leave. But now going to our friends, who were still friends with the EU, well, I still have to be, I've got both nationalities. And this is a study, and actually I'm pleased James is here because I'm going to mention the data that he generated with one of his PhD students. And this is a EU collaboration, and as I said, takes a lot of effort to put together so many centres to collect data. And the effort was to identify all the first episode psychosis patients coming to these different catchment area across Europe. And again, I say that population controls, this is very hard, let alone recruiting first episode, but finding people in the general population who are representative of the general population, and there's nothing wrong with them because they want to sit with you for 7 hours. I mean, think about that. If you agree to take part in the study, are you really representative? I don't know. But, we make a big effort to get really these people, and we were able to show that when you looked at general statistics from the census data, they did match for the main characteristics. So the effort was successful. So to move the issue of potency from London to Europe was a headache, and it was my first step. And I take pride in this because I even had to redo this for London. So this is me with some of my nice students, and the real scientist, who is the one on your left, who did actually the analysis. And this is a suitcase of 350 samples of cannabis. The economical value, I couldn't believe when they say this to me. And I had to carry this on the underground from Elephant and Castle to Waterloo campus where the analysis went done. And it smelled dreadfully. Well, it smells like skunk. And of course, I had a home office license, but I was very aware of, the classic thing that our patients say, people were looking at me. I know people were thinking, I did have that feeling that people were looking at me. So we went through this. This was a random selection of what the Met Police keeps at Marina House, which is the warehouse where they have all the seizure for drugs from the London metropolitan area. And I asked them to randomly select for me 360 samples, and believe it or not, 96 were skunk. And the police doesn't really know what they have in the bags when they put them in the... And so we redid a study in terms of what you find in skunk more recently. And this confirmed pretty much what you saw before. So skunk was in the range of 16%. Now don't look at these numbers, don't have nothing to do with skunk. And what was interesting is that there were very few, in fact only 1% of the sample were hashish, and the story had changed. There was much more THC on average, and the CBD was not one-to-one. And we could not find any imported herbal cannabis samples. So I had some idea that the story about high potency when I was looking about London. And then, thanks to the reports that this organization in the EU published, I was able to look at what you expect if you have in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is wonderful. Has any of you, I'm not going to ask you if you tried anything, has any of you been in a coffee shop in the Netherlands? So you know that you get a menu, and you know that on the menu you will get the percentages of THC, and now CBD goes very, very strongly. So the government publishes every year what is available in the coffee shop. So from the Netherlands you can get a very good breakdown if somebody reports a specific name or what to expect is in it. Spain, France are less consistent, but they had data similar to our home office, and the same for Italy and Brazil, which are all the places included in the study. So based on evidence from experimental study, animal model, and our previous work, we imposed a very conservative cutoff for 10%. So whenever somebody reported in their own native language a type of cannabis that I expected to have THC less than 10%, I put it in the low potency, and whenever it was equal or greater, it was in the high potency. This is very crude, but this is what you can do when you want to measure a lifetime exposure to a substance. I couldn't do blood tests for the previous 10 years and across Europe anyway. So what we did was to try and do the same combined measure of frequency and potency as we did in London, to see if this idea was again replicated within the all European sample. And indeed it was. Forget a little bit that the green bar tells you that the green bar is only adjusted for age, gender, and ethnicity. I don't take into account the importance of other drugs of abuse. And then when I adjust for any drug on site, we had actually very extensive information on hallucinogenic, ketamine, variety of stimulants, illegal highs, and mention it and we'll adjust for it. It goes down to the pink one. And even if you look only at the pink one, you can see that when you go from the reference of one never users to combination of potency and frequency, and you get into daily use of the potent type, so equal or more than THC, you get again a consistent finding of an odds ratio around 5. And what is interesting in this study is that even when you look at the daily use of what we call here low potency, which is a quite broad group, we do get an effect. And I think that's important because sometimes people say, oh, it's only high potency. But again, it's the same with alcohol. You can get drunk very quickly with whiskey, but if you drink enough lager, you still get drunk, you still become an alcoholic, and you still get liver cirrhosis. So I think we need to be careful that the active ingredient, lots of it can mean because it's very concentrated in what you smoke, or because you actually keep using it consistently. And this is something that people sometimes do find difficult to accept. And this is the slide that Claire was kindly going to show. And this is to say, okay, this is the overall sample. Sometimes it's useful when you look at the effect over a big group of centers, what's happening in individual ones, and see perhaps which are the ones that are driving mostly the effect. And it's no surprise that the ones that are driving the effect are the 3 biggest cities in the sample, which are, from your left, London, Amsterdam, and Paris. And if you look at Amsterdam, which is the middle one, look at the odds ratio for everyday use of high potency. It goes up to 9. This is the fully adjusted one. And this is because when you look at what's available in the Netherlands, and if I looked at the data we had, the most commonly type of cannabis that people reported is nether with. Nether with average THC goes up to 29%. So forget our skunk is pathetic. And some of the maximum level go up to 69%. And this is really the sort of skunk of South London. So this is what mostly people would choose if they are obviously regular user. I'm not talking about you going for the first time to Amsterdam in a coffee shop. But why should potency matter apart from the Queen? Well, it had an effect on our politics. This was this interpretation of the times of our study. He thought that the Brexit delusion were all driven by the London skunk. You believe it or not, it's not for me to say. But THC and CBD, we do know, have a differential effect in relation to what we're interested in as psychiatrists, cognition and psychotic symptoms. This is a summary of data that comes from lots of experimental study with healthy human participants and also animal model. And the association is very clear, where you do get an effect on cognition and on psychotic symptoms when you give THC to people or little mice that have nothing to do with psychosis. You can induce behavior or cognitive phenotype that are consistent with this. If you give CBD, you don't. To a point, the CBD has been given this, and please believe me, totally wrong label of being non-psychoactive, whatever that means. CBD binds the same receptor as THC, except is an inverse agonist, or if you like, an antagonist. So why should it not be psychoactive? I don't know. But the reason, this is the label that is been. So please don't say that CBD is not psychoactive. As you know, CBD or a CBD-based medication has now been licensed for epilepsy. Epilepsy is a condition that has to do with the central nervous system, so CBD has psychoactive properties. Sorry, this is my personal agenda on CBD. Anyway, this is a very nice experimental study in healthy volunteers, and these indeed are members of the academic community of the Institute of Psychiatry, so they might not be normal to start with, but at least they didn't have a PANSS score of clinical significance at baseline. So we did that. So this is Dr. Morrison, who gives them either placebo or THC intravenously. They were all very keen to try this study. And you can see that within 30 minutes, the one that gets THC, this is the peak, they actually do develop psychotic symptoms that you can pick up with the PANSS. Luckily, within 2 hours, they go away. Interestingly enough, a significant proportion of them needed benzodiazepine, so they actually got quite distressed. They became very paranoid. We didn't get visual hallucination, auditory hallucinations you might expect with other drugs, but they go extremely paranoid and distressed. They did get ethical permission, so it was within ethical realm. But this is a study done at a different time, where the same volunteers were given in one occasion CBD plus THC, and in another occasion placebo and THC. And you see that the group that gets CBD and THC is the one with the curve is dampened. And then the high curve, the one with the peak, is the one where you get THC and placebo. So the one that goes up and down is what you expect. You saw in the previous experiment, you give THC with placebo, and you get psychotic symptoms developing, and then they resolve. When you give CBD together with THC, you don't get that. You get a little peak, which is not really clinically relevant. So this was very interesting, and this is why we thought that in our first study in London, when we were coming across people reporting an hashish who had a 1-to-1 THC and CBD, perhaps in that group we didn't find an effect of cannabis types, or that cannabis type on the risk of developing psychosis. Again, something that has now changed. But what about going back to this issue of the impact at the population level? So this is something I'm very pleased, because it was very difficult to address this question. It wasn't that people had looked at it and didn't find any answer. It's just that we hadn't had for a very long time. You will all remember the famous WHO study in 1997 looking at differences in the incidence rates of psychotic disorder across different countries. But since it's not that in psychiatry, like in diabetes or cardiovascular disease, we get an incidence study every week. You know, we take many decades to be able to come up with studies that have compared incidence rates across different places with the same methodology. So it was thanks to James and his PhD that using the data from this big collaboration, new data on incidence rates across different geographical area were published. Have you read this paper? I think this should be on our desk. I think some of you are as old as me, some perhaps even a bit older. You will remember that the Oxford textbook of our generation would say that psychotic disorder and schizophrenia were an egalitarian disease, so it was the same for male and female and the same across the world. There's not such a complex disorder that obliges to these two criteria. Why we were made to believe that this was the case? Maybe we wanted to look different, but this is not the case. This will look like you would expect, again, in diabetes, in rheumatoid arthritis, in anything that's complex and multifactorial. You expect it to go up and down when you look across different settings. So these were the raw incidence rates, and you can see if you are in South London, probably don't need to read it. You look at the one with the highest rates, that's South London, and you look at the one in this picture with the lowest, or one of the lowest, where it's called Cathedral. Has any of you ever been to Palermo?
Yeah.
Yes. Good. Lucky, because you have reduced a bit your risk, at least for the period you were there. I was born in Palermo, so for me it wasn't a good move to go from there to London. And I'm still going back to the age of first episode. I'm still being female in the age of risk, so maybe I should move back. Anyway, so of course, James in the paper he published with Hanna Jogsma, he looked at some of the factors that could have contributed to these differences, and one of the things that they did is to obviously adjust for some of the key potential contributory factors, which were age, gender and minority status. And this is a version of the previous slides where I'm only reporting 11 sites, and there is a reason, because these are the one I included in my study, because these are the one where I had complete data set on cannabis data. And you can see that even when you adjust for age, gender and minority status, you have a reduce in this 8-fold variation that you had before, but you still have a significant variation in this zigzaggy up and down. So can we contribute, or can we try to explain this up and down with what's happening at the level of up and down is the proportion of people in the controls that represents the general population of these sites that reports high potency cannabis use. And it's not surprising that you get a huge green peak around Amsterdam. So they go up and down. Again, is this so groundbreaking? No. It seems to me I'm quite pleased that people think it is, but of course for my career, but in some way it isn't. When you look about, even in UK, which are the countries where we have seen most damage or most impact at the level of physical and mental health in relation to alcohol consumption is in the places where people are more likely to drink lots of alcohol. When you look in Italy, for instance, in southern Italy, alcohol consumption rates are very low. It's not one of the priority of the liver physician. They're more worried about hepatitis that you get from mussel and seafood. But when you go to northern Italy and there is grappa, that's what clinicians are very worried about, the effect of alcohol. So in some way, we are medics. We know that the distribution of risk factors can have a different impact. My thing is flashing. So I think population attributable fraction, the same story as in London, where you have lots of cannabis, you expect more cases to be attributed. So I'm not going to bore you with this, but I want to bore you with the cannabis clinic. So let's see if I can go. Oh, this is an important thing. When this data came out, people said, oh, well, you all have heard the disputes about the reason why there is this link between cannabis and psychosis is because people that use cannabis have got lots of genes for psychosis. The genes for psychosis make them more likely to use cannabis, and therefore then you find the association between cannabis and the disorder they are anyway predisposed to develop. This might be true for a portion of people, but this is not the whole story. So what we did was we actually look at the independent and combined effect of schizophrenia genes, summarized, as Claire was mentioning, with a polygenic risk score for schizophrenia. And then, of course, we use our measure of cannabis use, prioritizing the combination of frequency and potency. And what we found that in our sample that you're now familiar with, even when we adjusted for polygenic risk score, so for the effects of these genetic variants summarized together, we got an independent effect of daily use expressed as the gray one says daily use of high potency, in green daily use of low potency, and weekly use of high potency. The bottom line is that even for people who have a low schizophrenia genetic load, you get an effect of this on the risk of psychosis. It's not surprising, again, you see that all across medicine. If you have both, it's not a good news. So this is a graph that illustrates, like, for each line, each of these lines tells you in which group you are in terms of combination of potency and frequency. And on the x-axis, you have an increase in load of gene for schizophrenia. And you can see that with the increase in load of schizophrenia genes, for each of these groups, you have an increase in your probability to have a psychotic disorder. Again, if you are obese and you have hypertension, it's worse than you're only obese or you only have hypertension in relation to myocardial infarct. So what's next? So what is a complicated way to say what's next? Let's go to the cannabis clinic. Okay, so when you think something is missing in your catchment area, it's always good to mourn with the Royal College or with the Commission, but also it's good to see, can you get some money to do something and show that fast maybe your idea could work. So we did that, and we had something which is wonderful. It's the Mosley charity. I applied for a little lump sum, and we were given money to set up this cannabis clinic. People think it means I'm giving cannabis. I'm not. Although I am prescribing medicinal cannabis, but it's a sort of different approach. So this is Hannah. So we got money to employ Hannah only for 2 days a week, so we can imagine how little resources still we have. And Hannah is a trained mental health nurse who has lots of experience in addiction across the board, not just necessarily cannabis. And she's been trained to use a package of motivational interviewing and contingency management. When I say contingency management, is it clear what that is? Because I had to learn it. Contingency management is something that has been used in addiction to reward engagement with whatever is intervention. Pretty much it means giving vouchers or giving a financial reward. So when you talk to people who have an addiction, financial reward is important. Giving cash is not a good idea. But voucher have been proven very helpful for methadone clinic attendance and lots of other settings in addiction. So this is a package that's been developed for cannabis, so the motivational interview is tailored to the cannabis use and that this population. And the voucher we use them in a slightly different way. We personalize them. So when people come for the first session, they set their goals, they say what's important to them, and the voucher are different for each individual. The amount and the progression is the same for all of them, but the type of voucher is different. So she delivers the, if you like, psychological intervention. And this is just to say who we are. Apart from Darwin, that is just an inspiration. But I wanted to show the next one. So we've been given money only to accept referral for 20 patients to prove that this works. And we had a year to do this, and within the 2 months we got 18 referral. This tells you. So we're not going to be lacking referrals. And the first step for them is to see me. And it's not because I like the medical model, but because we do basic things that we will all do. So I go through that. I do a physical examination. I take blood tests as we would do in Leo as part of our health screening. So I type that with what the EI service will do anyway. So this is no extra work. And then I go through them the cannabis use. They use some scale. They measure dependence. We talk about tobacco use in our population. The comorbidity is 100%, and we need to take that into account. And then we give to each of these questionnaires useful because it gives a number. And so for these young people, it's good to see what the starting number is and how this number changes, rather than just getting my opinion that changing cannabis is good for them. They can actually measure it. And we do a cognitive assessment. They're very keen on the cognitive assessment. I use the ACE-3, so I'm not using anything new. They don't expect their memory to be so all over the place. They're very surprised. They actually get quite upset and said, I think I'm very clever. And you say, you are very clever, but if you're stoned for 12 hours out of 24, this is what happens to your memory. I mean, I'm not as brutal as this, don't get me wrong. But and when they see the change, I mean, we now have 6 people that actively half the way through the intervention. They see the change in their numbers. They actually quite like it. And we measure the cannabis in the urine, but it's not just a yes or no test. This is something we were able to buy that tells you the amount of THC. So they can monitor the THC level going up and down depending how well they've done in between session. And then of course we measure psychopathology as well, depending what the presentation is. So we are halfway through. Oh, and I should say, some of you mentioned this. I think actually Richard mentioned this in a different context. One thing we have set up, and I'm very proud of this because it was one of the most amazing experiences for me as a clinician, we have a peer group. So now we run a peer group twice a month. We've done 3 sessions. And the first one, we had somebody who has been a patient, still is on clozapine, but doing very well, who had used cannabis extensively before his onset and the beginning of his illness. And then he told to the others his story and his journey. And at the end of this, they all had a chat. They took some time to warm up and to see them exchanging with themselves the experience of actually being psychotic, as you said, of hearing a voice and being absolutely sure it's real, or being paranoid because a sound to them is not just a sound but links to the idea that confirms harm. And see them discussing this rather than what we normally do by reading in books was extraordinary. I mean, it really made it real beyond the clinical experience. And then the power of a very pretty young girl among all my patients right now are all male. She came along and said, you all, what are you doing with your life? I changed my cannabis use and now I'm back to work. And she got them one-to-one and questioned them what they're up to with the cannabis use. I could not do that. I would come across very patronizing. And to see them then replying to her and engaging, that was great. So we're trying to do this more often, but it costs money. As well, because we of course reimburse their time. So this is a big net that I draw with them. So this is their journey. This is what they think they want to be or they want to become. And I'm very pleased about the 2 little hearts, because this is actually one of my patients who is a very, very clever. He's a mathematician. He had a degree. And I said to him, where do you want to be at the end of this? I want a girlfriend. And I said, okay, I can't promise it, but you can put 2 hearts as your contribution to the post-cannabis brain. And this is just to say there's lots about cannabis as a medicine. I'm actually prescribing in the clinic Sativex as harm reduction. So the young mathematician smokes 20 joints a day. So now we have an agreement that for the first 8 hours of his day, he will only use Sativex, 10 puff each morning. It's still a lot of THC, but it's much less than 12 joints of skunk, and his THC in the urine has dropped of 35%, which is quite good. And at least in the morning he can function. So it's not an easy journey. I mean, you don't start with people that say to you, oh, it's a very good idea, I'm stop using cannabis. But the endocannabinoid system, and I want to link this, and then I promise I stop, because this red thing is making me anxious. Claire mentioned neurodevelopment, and absolutely rightly said, lots of things can mess up the neurodevelopment. And adolescence is the time when the majority of people, when you look at population study or our study, start using cannabis. And we do have this thing, the endocannabinoid system, which didn't exist when I did, well, it didn't exist, and not being described when I did medical school. But now we know it does lots of things, and most important is a healthy helmet. It's an on-demand system that gets switched on and off to regulate through GABA and glutamate the neurons, exactly that Claire showed earlier, dopamine firing, and in general the excitability of the cortex. So he has a direct effect on how well the cortex is functioning and how well the cortex cope with stress, biological stress, immunological stress. You get encephalitic, this system gets activated. You get stroke, this system gets activated. You get head injury, this system gets activated. But otherwise it's quiet. So to bombard this system with THC all the time, THC is an agonist to this system, like what we produce, the endocannabinoid, all the time. Again, you can imagine how it disrupts his ability to become a healthy helmet when this is needed. And there are lots of studies that have begun to link a malfunction of the endocannabinoid system with psychosis and with symptom profile as well. We don't have time to get in details. So should we prescribe cannabis? Well, do we know what we're doing? Now, my problem is that I do this for a living, but I don't actually know what I'm doing. So if I had to prescribe an aspirin, I would roughly still know what I'm doing, even I'm a psychiatrist. And I know that one thing you don't prescribe cannabis to an adolescent, or you can produce this encephalitis and kill them potentially. So we know about side effects, as well as we know about indication and interaction, and we know about the dose range depending on what we're trying to do. And this applies even to our demonized antipsychotic. We know they're not great, but we have learned what to do, and we still are, but at least we've done some training. What about cannabis? Most of the people who are prescribing cannabis in this country have not received a formal training. Have you ever seen the Royal College advertising a pharmacology course on the prescription of cannabis? So how on earth are we supposed to know what to do? So we do know the adverse effect, and some of them, because I recently met a physician who told me, do you know what's happening to the lung of young people I see who smoke cannabis? I said no, because of course it's beyond right now but we do know enough about some of the side effects, at least the one to our area. And we know there's some indication, although for most of these, I don't know if you've seen the NICE guidelines, there's still some controversy. But the bottom line, we don't know about the dose. So even if we were convinced, and I belong to a group with pain physicians who are reviewing the evidence. If you ask a pain physician, okay, if you have neuropathic pain, what's the amount of cannabis you should give? They don't know. What's the ratio THC CBD you should give? I don't know. This idea that it's all down to CBD is wrong. CBD is only alone effective, perhaps together with antiepileptic for epilepsy, this rare syndrome in children. But most of the other conditions that people have claimed cannabis is beneficial do include THC, even up to 18%. So we do really need to know what we're doing. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be using cannabis. I'm using it for harm reduction, but I think we should receive some training. And I would actually like to go if there was such training available. And again, I've taken enough of your time, so thank you very much. And of course, once again, this couldn't have happened without the patients that took part in the study, first of all, and all the other people that contributed. Thank you very much.
So today my talk is going to be on migration and mental health, in particular psychosis and psychotic disorders. I'm actually from Bath, originally, so I live in Cambridge, so I know what it's a bit like to be a migrant in a strange land, but thank you for inviting me to Bristol. It's very nice to be here, and you've made me feel very welcome. So on a more serious note, I think I'm going to try to persuade to you now that migration is one of the largest challenges that humans can undertake. It's a process that involves changing your environment completely. And for some migrants, we think that the stresses and strains that can lead to can increase your risk of developing certain mental health conditions. And the one that I'm interested in today is schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders and the role that plays. I'm going to try and convince you over the next sort of 30 minutes or so that this is one of the preeminent public health inequalities that we face today in psychiatry, and I think it's a neglected topic that if we could find the causes of that excess risk amongst migrants and their children, we would prevent very large percentage of all cases of psychotic disorder. So at the start of this talk, there are probably about 4 things that I really want to impart to you. The first is that we know that there are higher risk of psychotic disorders amongst migrants, and we know that that risk extends to the children of migrants. So this is not simply a case of migration itself as a risk factor. Unbelievably, almost for the 21st century, we almost know nothing about the potential causes of this excess risk amongst migrant groups, and that's what I'm going to try and talk to you today a little bit more about. As I said, I'm going to try and convince you that this is the public mental health inequality of our times. So a little bit of context, I'm going to take you through some background to where this research has all come from, the proposed hypotheses to explain this excess risk amongst migrants and minority groups, the current research that my group in UCL have been conducting on this work over the last 5 to 10 years, and then I think primarily as a psychiatric epidemiologist. I come from a social science background, but I recognise that this research is embedded in a whole range of other perspectives, and I'm going to touch on other areas of research which can inform us, particularly the role of neuroscience in this domain, before closing and thinking about how and why prevention should be at the top of our list. So to give you some background, on average, we know that migrants are about 2.5 times more likely than non-migrant groups to develop a psychotic disorder. That's true in many countries throughout Western Europe, including the UK and Canada and North America, Australia and so forth. But for some migrant groups, that risk is up to 5 times greater than the risk for the non-migrant population. In the UK context, an example is amongst the Black Caribbean and Black African population living here, both first-generation migrants and their children, and to some extent we think their grandchildren, who continue to exhibit high rates of psychosis that are 5 times higher than the rate for the white British population. So a real public health inequality that these groups face. I want to roll back the time a little bit and think about the context in which people migrate. And we know for hundreds of years that migrants are often treated very poorly by the countries in which they migrate to. This is not a new phenomenon of Nigel Farage and Theresa May. This is a time immemorial problem. It's illustrated here in a cartoon from a periodical in the US called Judge magazine. This was printed in 1891, and a Trump-like figure is saying to Uncle Sam, look at the perils of unrestricted migration and what happens when we let in all of these European migrants. And depicted in this cartoon, you might not be able to see it too closely, are people from Ireland, from Italy, from Poland, reflecting the main migrations to the US at the time. So the idea that migrants are treated differently with hostility when they arrive in different countries, and that this might be a source of stress for those migrant groups, is something that's been in existence for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Why do I start here? Well, going back from 1891 to 1880, this is actually an illustration from the 1880 census of the USA, and remarkably, in the US census in that decade, in 1880, people were asked to enumerate anybody in their family who was classified as insane. So there are, and that you will all know that that's not the best way of enumerating populations, especially amongst your own family. But nevertheless, that was undertaken, and so there are records of self-reported levels of insanity in the U.S. Census. And the special agent for the census, a guy called Frederick Howard Wise, Times said that there was an extraordinary ratio of insanity among the foreign-born classes, and that this has attracted wide attention. And this really caught my interest, so I went back to the census, and you can actually enumerate this. You can look at it, and when you look at it, you see that amongst the foreign-born groups, the self-reported levels of insanity are about 45% higher than amongst the American-born, by American-born I mean non-native in this case, American-born, predominantly white European, I imagine, population. So there's this excess risk amongst migrants as far back as 1880. By coincidence, this photo is also from 1880. This is taken in the US. This is a photo of a woman called Barrett Hagerback, and Barrett is pictured outside her sod house in Minnesota. And you'll guess by her name that she wasn't born in the US. She was actually a Norwegian immigrant and had moved to the US during the 1860s to 1880s period. And she, like many other Norwegians, left Norway due to a series of extreme famines that happened over successive winters, leading to mass starvation, lots of deaths, diseases, and immigration on a scale unlike which has really been seen before. Over the period from 1860 to 1910, 1 in 3 Norwegians left Norway and specifically moved mostly to the US to relocate to environments, as you'll know from if you've seen Fargo, environments like Minnesota, which are not dissimilar to the cold and quite difficult conditions that are often faced in Norway. So there's this mass migration, and it was so big that this is another sod house, this time pictured outside Nebraska, but this migration was so big that the Norwegian government commemorated this on a stamp published in 1973 to recognise, I'm not going to pronounce that in Norwegian in case there's any Norwegians in the room, but out-migration to America. And so you can see from that image of how important this migration was. But that migration, and I suppose dating back to the census when rates of insanity were first compiled, that mass migration of Norwegians to the US didn't go unnoticed by the psychiatric community. And some of you will recognise this man in the photograph. This is a man called Unalv Odgaard. He published his doctoral thesis entitled Emigration and Insanity, which was one of his finer achievements. He also did unauthorised lobotomies, which was one of his less fine achievements. But he was a fantastic epidemiologist. You don't have to take my word for that. He was one of the first epidemiologists to introduce, in psychiatry, to introduce the notion of control groups. So for a period of, I think, 5 to 10 years, he looked at all records of hospitalised admissions in the US for Norwegian immigrants in Minnesota presenting with different psychiatric conditions, and he compared them to 2 different control groups, and that's really what makes his work, sets his work apart from other groups. He compared them not only to the native-born population in America and their rates of hospitalised admissions for disorder, but also to Norwegians who hadn't emigrated from Norway. I'm just going to show you a snippet of that work from his doctoral thesis. I've got on here 2 disorders. You'll see in the blue or the green colour rates of schizophrenia for Norwegians who had remained in Norway on the left-hand side and Norwegian emigrants on the right-hand side. And you'll see clearly for schizophrenia an increased risk of hospitalised admissions for schizophrenia amongst Norwegian migrants, but not amongst those Norwegians who'd remained behind in Norway. No differences you'll notice in the orange bars for depression. When he compared these rates to the rates for the American-born population, he also found similar differences, suggesting that there was an issue specifically to do with the migrant groups. And for those of you who know Odgaard's work well, you'll know that he believed that the explanation for this raised rate of schizophrenia amongst Norwegian immigrants was due to selection issues, particularly selection issues that motivated people to move after those famines, whereby he felt that those famines were stress factors, risk factors for later schizophrenia. But he went beyond that, and he suggested that there was something vulnerable, genetically vulnerable, about those people who were exposed to famine in the first place, and that this wasn't a causal risk, but this was people predisposed to schizophrenia being more likely to migrate. So as we heard in one of the prize-winning talks, this is an issue of reverse causation. It's not migration driving schizophrenia, but schizophrenia possibly driving the migration. Now we can think a little bit about whether that stacks up as a likely hypothesis for this a bit later. More recently, some work by my former PhD student, now postdoctoral research in our department in the UCL, has looked at the same issue, this time updating the analysis to a Swedish context, looking at the risk of psychotic and depressive illnesses amongst people who migrated to Sweden in a cohort of about 1.8 million people across the whole country. And she sees fairly similar results for that Odegaard saw. So for schizophrenia, both migrants in blue and children of migrants in orange show elevated risks of schizophrenia and other schizoaffective disorders compared to the Swedish-born population. For other non-affective psychotic disorders, a similar pattern plays out with some slight reduction, I suppose. She then looked at bipolar disorder with and without psychosis. Bipolar disorder with psychosis still shows an elevation in risk compared to the Swedish-born group amongst those two migrant groups. But for bipolar disorder without any presence of psychotic symptoms, we see a completely different pattern. So for children of migrants, their risk is about the same as for the Swedish-born population. And actually for migrants themselves, this risk is significantly lower than in the Swedish-born population. I suppose the take-home from this is that there seems to be something perhaps specific to the role of migration or being a member of a minority group that acts specifically on the psychotic element of psychiatric disorders rather than perhaps the affective element. And that's something that we're kind of actively looking at the moment. So what about some hypotheses? What are the hypotheses that explain this risk? I'm going to take you through 5. So first, the idea of selective migration. Second, the idea that demographic differences might account for these differences in rates of disorder between different groups. Third, that simply there's no causal element to this, but simply that migrants come from areas where there are already high rates in those populations, and so there's no issue of migration. It's just that migrants who might come from one country, that country has naturally high rates of disorder. Fourth, I'm going to touch on the thorny issue of misdiagnosis, and I'm going to duck when I talk about this to you guys, for reasons that will emerge. And finally, I'm going to talk about the role that social stressors might play in this risk. So, selective migration. We've heard a little bit that Odegaard thought this was the primary reason, that people essentially who were predisposed to psychosis were more likely to migrate, this idea of reverse causality. Well, those of you who, and that's most of you, or a lot of you I think today, who work clinically and work in psychosis services or people with psychosis, for people particularly with psychotic disorders or in the prodromal phase of psychotic disorders, imagining that a migration might be possible, especially an international migration which might require complex travel arrangements, the organising of tickets, the organising of visas and so forth. This might seem like quite a difficult challenge for some people and might make migration, if anything, less likely than more likely. So there's a kind of theoretical argument to why this might not seem to be an obvious or intuitive solution. But there's ways we can test this. And I'm going to do this by looking at the work that I just showed you from my PhD student, Jen. And what we can do is say, well, actually, if selection is responsible for these higher risks, we would expect people who migrate with psychosis, with a prevalent case of psychosis, to actually show up fairly quickly to services once they arrive in Sweden because of the ongoing need for care. So if we take those people and we exclude them from our study, do we still see an excess risk of psychosis amongst migrants who might not present for until a few years later, who are unlikely to be prevalent or pre-existing cases? So in this case, we excluded anybody from the analysis who presented very quickly after migration, so people who presented within 2 years, which we reasoned was a sufficient length of time to capture people who had a pre-existing case of psychosis on arrival in Sweden. And we re-estimated the results. So these, firstly, are the results for migrants that I just showed you. And then we exclude those groups who presented very quickly, and we don't see very much attenuation in rates at all, suggesting that, to me this suggests, and you might disagree, but to me this suggests that selection is probably an unlikely explanation of these higher rates of psychotic disorders amongst migrant populations. Demographic differences is a quick and easy one to refute. So demographic differences really is a bit of an old hypothesis now, but traditionally, particularly when a lot of this research emerged in the UK after the Second World War, where migrants tended to be more likely to be young men to help rebuild the UK economy after the Second World War, that some people thought, well, it might be just simply these demographic differences that explain differences in risk between migrants and non-migrant groups, because we know that young men are much more likely to develop psychosis. We can refute that. This is data from one of many examples, but this is data from a study that I conducted in East Anglia called the Social Epidemiology of Psychosis in East Anglia study. That's the CEPIA study for short. And although East Anglia has a relatively small ethnic minority population, when we conduct that first episode study, we still see higher rates of psychotic disorder amongst various different ethnic minority groups, including people from Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Black African, Black Caribbean, and mixed ethnic backgrounds, even after adjusting for potential age-sex differences. In fact, the only group we don't see an elevated risk for are essentially European white migrants coming to the UK. So age and sex alone aren't sufficient explanations of this increased risk amongst migrants, but of course we know that on average, and of course there's variation amongst this, but on average, migrant and ethnic minority groups tend to come from lower socioeconomic positions, and so perhaps it's not migration or ethnicity at all that's the driver of this increased risk, but socioeconomic status. And of course we can adjust for that, and when we do, we see some attenuation in risk, but on average, for most groups, except for the Bangladeshi group where we lose power, the excess risk of psychotic disorders remains statistically significantly raised compared to the white British group. So these socio-demographic differences alone don't account for the excess risk of psychotic disorders that we tend to see amongst migrant and ethnic minority groups. So what about high rates in people's country of origin? Well, I'm just going to show you one example. This is actually a really massively under-researched area still, partly because of the difficulty of conducting methodologically solid studies in low middle income settings where often there are difficulties in establishing caseness of psychosis in very resource poor environments often. But some studies were done, particularly in the context of the UK, that's relevant in the Caribbean in the late 1990s, because of this excess risk of psychotic disorders amongst Caribbean migrants to the UK. This is one of those studies. This was conducted by Mayhe and colleagues in Barbados and in London. And it was a very nice study, probably the best of the three studies that were conducted in the Caribbean, I think, on this subject. And they compared the rate of psychotic disorders amongst the white London population, the Black Caribbean London population, and the Black Caribbean population in Barbados. And what you'll see on the screen is that the rates of psychotic disorder reported for the white population in London and for the Black Caribbean population in Barbados are more or less the same. So no evidence of higher rates of psychotic disorder amongst the Black Caribbean population in Barbados. We only see those elevated rates amongst the Black Caribbean population in London once the migration event has occurred. So on these types of studies, we can exclude that hypothesis. But as I say, those studies are currently limited to the Caribbean. We know virtually nothing from sub-Saharan Africa. We know virtually nothing from India and from elsewhere in the world as well. And that's a clear gap in the research, which people like Craig Morgan, for those of you who've read his work, are trying to address at the moment, and we'll be publishing shortly. Okay, so I'm going to come on to misdiagnosis, which I think we have to address in the context of this research. And I think the research to support or refute this is not as solid as it should be and could be, but is an important issue to tackle for us because it challenges the whole realm of whether or not the work I'm presenting today to you has genuinely increased rates of psychosis in ethnic minority and migrant communities or not. So the misdiagnosis hypothesis or argument posits that the excess risk of psychotic disorders amongst migrant and minority groups are due to one of two things, or maybe both of them. First, racist psychiatric practice, simply that psychiatrists are more likely to give someone a label of schizophrenia who is from an ethnic minority or migrant background than someone who is not. Second, that culturally insensitive diagnostic tools that we use to make decisions about who has schizophrenia or who has another type of psychotic disorder don't apply to all people. Culturally appropriate behaviours in someone from an African context or someone from an Asian context are misinterpreted by our diagnostic systems as something that seems psychotic. And those two things together lead to this idea that there's an over-diagnosis of psychotic disorders amongst migrant and ethnic minority groups, and that there's a non-causal explanation for this excess risk of disorder. Now, when you dig into the evidence for this, I believe that there's not very good evidence to support these theories, and I don't believe there's very good evidence to refute these theories. However, what happens is that these ideas get conflated with some very real structural injustices in care and outcomes that we know migrants and minority groups face within our healthcare system for psychotic disorder. So we do know that there's evidence that migrants and ethnic minority groups are more likely to come to the attention of services through coercive pathways to care. We know that they are more likely to face longer inpatient stays. We know that they're overrepresented on secure wards, and we know that they're less likely to receive second-generation antipsychotics. So there's really strong evidence that the care pathway that migrants or minority groups experience have massive inequalities compared to the care pathways of a non-migrant or ethnic majority population. And these are real injustices that need sort of ironing out and removing from our healthcare system so that everybody benefits from the best standard of care possible. But if health services are that bad at doing those things, so the argument goes, then surely the excess risk of psychotic disorders amongst migrants is also due to misdiagnosis and so forth. And so these things become conducive of this general mistrust or distrust of mental health services. I believe that's a very dangerous proposition, because if we do see an excess risk of psychotic disorders that is causal, that is due to factors that migrants or ethnic minority groups experience, and we deny that, then we are denying a serious public mental health problem to a group that urgently needs care on average more than other groups. So what evidence is there to support this idea that misdiagnosis might explain these high rates? Well, I want to return to this study by Mayhe and colleagues. This study, remember, uses the same standardized diagnostic tools and the same set of psychiatrists to make the same evaluations of the groups who live in Caribbean and the groups who live in London. So if there was either culturally insensitive diagnostic tools being used or racist psychiatric practice, we should see that play out in the data here. And that should play out by showing higher rates amongst the Black Caribbean, both the Black Caribbean groups, but not amongst the white group. However, in Mayhe and colleagues' study, we see that the only elevation in risk is amongst Black Caribbean migrants to the UK and not amongst Black Caribbean migrants, as I said, in Barbados, which I think to me that's certainly not consistent with the idea that misdiagnosis explains these higher rates of psychotic disorder, but perhaps we can debate that at the end. So what about the role of social stressors? Well, I want to turn to two examples, and the first, as the title of my talk suggests, is on refugee groups, who we've been able to look at in the context of the Swedish population. So a few years ago now, my colleagues and I published a paper in a BMJ on 1.3 million people living in Sweden to look at differences in risk between the Swedish-born population and migrant groups, including refugees. We asked two questions. One, were refugees at higher risk of psychotic disorders than native-born Swedes, which seems like a fairly safe question to ask. And two, were refugees at higher risk of psychotic disorders than other migrant groups from the same region of origin? And our argument here was that that refugees have obviously, by definition, undergone a certain level of trauma and difficult and stressful life events to be given the given a status of refugee status. And the fair comparison to make is whether or not that extra trauma that those groups experience raises their risk of psychosis compared to other people from the same region of origin who have migrated to Sweden as well. So the analysis, although it's on 1.3 million people, most of those people are Swedish, and we had to group migrants into regions which were fairly broad. So these are people who have migrated to Sweden from areas where there's been large refugee migrations. Those areas include sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa and the Middle East. Asia grouped as one category, but actually in the context of Sweden, that's mostly people from Central Asia, from Afghanistan, and from other areas caught up in the conflicts, first with the Russians and then more latterly with the US and the UK, who have migrated or been refugees in Sweden, as well as refugees and migrants from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union for very similar reasons. The Yugoslavian wars in the 1990s and so forth. So Sweden, until I think 2016, took more refugees on a per capita basis than any other European country, with the exception of Turkey. Turkey, being close to the Syrian border, took many more refugees than that. But certainly of the Western European countries, Sweden has a high record of taking large numbers of refugees from these areas. So what did we find? Well, after adjusting for some basic confounding factors, we found that non-refugee groups from these regions were about 1.75 times more likely to develop psychosis than the Swedish-born population. But for refugees, this risk was close to 3 times greater. When we compared the risk between refugees and non-refugees from the same regions of origin, we found on average that refugees had about a 66% increased risk of developing psychotic disorder compared to non-refugees from those same regions. The second example of social stresses I want to give, so that's social stresses that occur before the migration. I now want to think about social stresses that occur in the context of the post-migratory environment. And one of those ideas is this idea of socio-cultural distance. And this is work done by my, again, a former PhD student of mine, Hannah Youngsma, currently with work under review. And she wanted to ask the question, does the social experience following migration affect psychosis risk? And in particular, is the disempowerment that migrants and ethnic minority groups that they might face, is that psychosocial disempowerment, that removal of autonomy or the ability to influence their environment, does that psychosocial disempowerment explain the increased risk of psychotic disorders amongst these groups? So disempowerment describes the process of control and autonomy over one's environment. It might arise in the context of migration and ethnic minority status due to greater social and cultural distance from the majority population, and we're going to operationalise that in this study. And Hannah's hypothesis was that this elevated risk would be explained in ethnic minority groups would be explained by socio-cultural difference. So her data comes from a study that you've heard a bit about today. This is the EUGI study. It's a case control study of about 1,100 cases and 1,100 controls from 17 centres in Italy, UK, Netherlands, France, Spain, Brazil. We've measured social disadvantage through education, parental socioeconomic status, and social isolation. And then Hannah's operationalised her measure of cultural distance through language. And so we know that language has the ability to influence how close and easy you are to fit into the country in which you've moved to. And you can measure this quite accurately using 2 things. First, fluency in the language of the country you've moved to. So if you're moving from Italy to Spain, how easy is it for you to speak Spanish and so forth, and that's just rated by self-report. The second thing is the distance of your native language to the language of the country you've moved to on a language tree. So if you're moving from Italy to Spain, both of those languages share the same Latin root structure, but if you're moving from China to the UK, where your language is Mandarin, and you're moving to the UK's kind of hybrid, whatever it is, Latin/Germanic root structure, then there's a bigger difference in the difference between your 2 languages is larger, and that's a proxy for socio-cultural differences. And we can combine those 2 measures of language distance to get some measure of your socio-cultural difference. We can also look at disempowerment directly, of course, by asking people about their experiences of racism, and this is a self-reported experiences of times people have been discriminated against in their lives. Hannah's used logistic regression and multiple imputation to handle missing data. I'm not going to go into that now. And this is what she finds. I'm just going to walk you through these slides. So before we adjust for anything, we see that migrants are about twice as likely migrants or ethnic minority groups are about twice as likely to experience psychosis than the white majority population. When we adjust for some basic background factors, including childhood trauma, cannabis use, parental history of psychosis, and age and sex, we see some reduction in that risk. So some of that goes away, but on average, ethnic minority groups remain at elevated risk of psychotic disorder. We then adjust for those additional markers of social disadvantage, because they might be responsible for psychosocial disempowerment, and we don't see much attenuation in our risk. Actually, those social disadvantage markers don't explain much more than the confounders we've already included in the model. But when we include language distance in the model, we see another significant reduction in the risk of psychosis amongst ethnic minority groups, such that now, by this point, having controlled for all 3 of those things, there's no increased risk left amongst ethnic minority groups compared to the white majority population. So in other words, a combination really of those background predisposing factors like childhood trauma, parental history of psychosis, combined with socio-cultural difference, fully explain the excess risk of psychotic disorders amongst the ethnic minority groups. When we finally add in discrimination, by this point we don't see an additional effect of discrimination, presumably because it's already captured in the other measures that we've included in the model. What's nice about this work, which is under review at the moment, is that Hannah has been able to replicate these patterns independently for various different ethnic minority groups, people from black ethnic minority backgrounds, people from Asian backgrounds, people from North African and mixed ethnic backgrounds. So these results replicate independently across all of those different groups. When we look at differences between first and second generation groups, we see that cultural distance measured by language is more important for people who are migrants. A distinguished group of researchers from many different centres, including Phil Maguire and Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg, first authored Alice Egerton, who was part of Oliver Howe's group in London. And they looked at dopamine sensitization amongst migrants and non-migrants in a PET imaging paradigm. And what's quite beautiful about this research is they looked at 3 different groups who have got increasingly high risk of psychosis. So firstly, a healthy volunteer group, secondly, an ultra high risk or at-risk mental state group, and third, a group with schizophrenia. And what you can see as you move into the clinical spectrum of psychosis, you see a bigger mismatch between dopamine activation between immigrants and non-immigrants. It's present for all 3 of those groups, but as we move towards the clinical phenotype of psychotic disorder, there's a stronger dopaminergic sensitivity reaction in migrants compared to non-migrants, suggesting that some of the environmental experiences that they experience are directly linked to changes in the brain that are related to dopaminergic pathways that we know are important in the onset of psychotic phenomena. So this isn't just epidemiologists looking at large data sets, there's some neuroscientific evidence to support this type of work as well. So what does this all mean? It's challenging to come to a conference of psychiatrists because you really want to know what does this mean for clinical practice. And I think the best I can offer you is that there is a sort of need for care amongst people who come from ethnic minority backgrounds who are on average, we believe, more likely to experience psychotic disorder. And to give you some indication of the potential prevention we could achieve if we were able to identify those risk factors and prevent them and remove them from society, we could prevent 21% or 22% of all cases of psychotic disorders that you would see. So if we knew what was causing this excess risk amongst ethnic minority groups alone, 1 in 5 of your cases would stop coming to your door overnight, we believe. In ethnic minority groups alone, that reduction is 2/3. So 2 out of 3 ethnic minority group people wouldn't develop a psychotic disorder. So these are large numbers of potential gains for prevention that we really need to think about because of this excess risk amongst ethnic minorities. But of course, prevention depends on the identification of these causal factors. I think that you'll know from this talk that migration or ethnic minority status alone aren't sufficient or necessary. These aren't the answers. These are just clues as to what type of factors that these groups might be experiencing to increase risk. I've shown you that for the first time, and I think this is quite interesting work that Hannah's done, that for the first time in a century and a half of this research, someone's been able to show that you can change the excess risk of psychosis in migrant and ethnic minority groups by adjusting for relevant factors. We don't see that in the earlier work I presented when we adjusted for socioeconomic status alone, it made no difference. We do see that when we start adjusting for the levels of disempowerment people might be experiencing. And so I believe that might be a real candidate mechanism for understanding where this excess risk comes from. To fully elucidate that, of course, we need more genuine interdisciplinary research. We need to work much more closely with other colleagues from other disciplines. And I'll leave you with this thought, and that's that through interdisciplinary effort, I think we can prevent this public mental health inequality within a generation. So before I finish, I'd just like to thank everybody from my group and my collaborators over the years, to Dheeraj and to Liz for inviting me today to come and speak to you. And those are my contact details should you ever wish to get in touch. So thank you very much.